Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Attorney General, for being here, particularly at a moment when I know you and the entire Justice Department is offering full assistance to your counterparts in France to respond to this horrific terrorist attack. I want to focus my questions really on gun violence in our country, and specifically, as you know, under federal law, a gun seller may transfer a firearm to a purchaser after 72 business hours, even if the background check has not been completed. And because of that, it's called default proceed policy within the department. And because of that, gun dealers went forward with almost 16,000 sales to people who turned out to be prohibited purchasers between 2010 and 2014. So my first question is, do you think that the default proceed policy should be changed to a policy that says firearm sales may only occur if the background check has been completed and the transfer approved?
Certainly, you raise an important issue about gun safety and our background system. We have been looking specifically at this issue, given the unfortunate tragic circumstances that allowed Dylan Roof to purchase a firearm. And what I will say, though, is that while it certainly does make it challenging and make it difficult to ensure that we keep firearms out of those who are prohibited, that is the current state of the law.
No, I understand that, but you agree, do you not, Madam Attorney General, that if the law, in fact, said the background check has to be completed and the transfer approved, we would reduce the likelihood that people who are ineligible, 16,000 in that 4-year period, from purchasing firearms, correct?
Certainly it would provide law enforcement with another tool to make sure that firearms are out of the hands of prohibited persons. And should Congress consider something, we'd be happy to provide input and comment on that.
So when that information is determined, when it's determined that a person is a prohibited purchaser, the agency sends out a retrieval notice to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, correct?
Yes. If a prohibited person does obtain a weapon, there's a retrieval notice.
And so do you know what happens to those cases in which ATF is directed to retrieve a firearm? With respect
to retrieval notices, ATF will designate an agent to investigate the location and whereabouts of the individual and the firearm and retrieve that firearm from that person.
So under current law and practice, no notice is provided to local law enforcement or to the U.S. Attorney's Office in that jurisdiction. Is that correct?
It is done through ATF. That is correct.
So that we have information that in at least some of these cases, someone who is ineligible because they're a convicted felon has purchased a firearm, but we don't provide notice to local law enforcement or to the U.S. Attorney's Office, only to ATF.
That's the current system, yes.
Okay. You would agree that providing that information to local law enforcement or to the U.S. Attorney's Office would allow them to prosecute some number of individuals who criminally and in violation of federal law bought a gun with a criminal record?
Congressman, I agree that certainly the sharing of all relevant information helps all law enforcement. Every case would have to be looked at differently and with respect to the individual facts of each case.
In addition, I want to just focus your attention for a moment, Madam Attorney General, on the NICS system. Director Comey testified before our committee that receiving timely records from state and local law enforcement was a potential area for improvement. Are there legislative efforts we can undertake to increase compliance by state and local governments? Is it your sense that it's a lack of federal standards, general administrative difficulties, or is it just non-compliance? And what can we do as members of Congress to try to encourage or require compliance with the NICS system, because it's only as good as the information that's contained within it?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, the NICS system is an important part of our background check system, and we do rely very heavily on information from our state and local counterparts. In many instances, we have excellent reporting from those counterparts. In some instances, it is not as robust as we need, and anything that could be done to improve that would be useful. Certainly, you could consider legislation. We also have been working directly, speaking directly with those localities to encourage them to improve reporting to the current system.
And one final question, Madam Attorney General. Congressman Deutsch made reference to this challenging issue of the definition of engaged in the business of dealing firearms. Even the ATF has said that this very vague standard frustrates prosecutions. It allows people who regularly sell guns to avoid the requirements of background checks. And some have suggested that you could issue a regulation that would provide greater clarity and define that. We recognize legislation is also possible, but would you agree to at least look at whether or not you have the ability to issue clarifying legislation that will attempt to reach these individuals who are regularly engaged in the sale of firearms but are not determined or to be engaged in the business of dealing firearms and thereby go free from any of the constraints that exist for firearms sales and present significant dangers as a result?
The gentleman's time has expired. The Attorney General can answer.
Thank you, sir. Congressman, with respect to the important issue of our firearm statutes, obviously significant changes would have to be considered and implemented by Congress, and should they be considered, we'd be happy to provide input and guidance there. In the current statutory scheme, we always do everything that we can to ensure robust enforcement under the current statutes. It involves, for example, outreach on the part of ATF to gun dealers to provide guidance to them as to their activities. That goes on a regular basis so that we can, in fact, increase and encourage compliance on the part of dealers.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent that this first report, the FBI data shows thousands of gun sales beat checks, be introduced as part of the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
I'd ask unanimous consent that this article entitled Walmart has tougher policies for background checks than the U.S. government does.
Without objection.
And finally, a report entitled Business as Usual, prepared by Everytown for Gun Safety, How Volume Gun Sellers Fuel the Criminal Market.
Without objection.